Dr. Patnaik, please come. Please. Please. He's Dr. Sunil Patnaik, very committed, excavator, and has written many Buddhist sites. She is calling, and he is Professor Max. Yeah,
Yes, not a central
it was last period.
Yeah, and when you discuss this with Abhishek, actually, when I saw the picture, I said, of course, Abhishek. I mean, it's, I made the connection, yeah, of course, it's,
Of course.
Especially for companies.
Hello, is that? Welcome.
Morning.
It's very convenient. Yes. But here, I mean, you will not sit properly.
Well, this one.
This one is
Actually, you know what? Not sharing each maybe. Yes, that's how it works in business. Yes. Exactly. So that's why we sit down. You mean with the business? Yeah. You're pointing at me. Yeah, sure. It's not true. It's I see. Yeah, they kind of responded. I'll let you go. I used to have the Mac, because everybody had the Mac, but I also used the Windows and had the Mac.
Yeah,
She's happy to do it. She's doing the basic stuff. And I understand that some designers are using they're using software. I don't presentation from I would like to see it. Remote control. Yes, remote control for the node.
From there, you can operate laptop from there.
Yeah. Pointer.
Pointer and
No, I mean I don't have much.
pointer is here. Why is that there?
What is here?
You don't have much picture.
Oh, it's excellent.
You have pointer, I have.
No, I don't. Okay, thank you. I think so. Always decoration. Really. Hopefully the batteries.
Everybody could come to occupy the chairs.
People can come here so that the chairs are occupied. Yes,
Hello? Everybody please occupy the chairs around the table first and then occupy the chairs that are kept behind. We start the program in the next 5-10 minutes.
requirement for imagination.
Well, because you
That's a great consideration.
color that this is much, but I wouldn't see anything else. Actually, has to be because they want to make those so they make it point to be
A very good morning to everybody present here. Bihar Heritage Development Society welcomes all the scholars, both national and international, for the two-day international conference titled History and Archaeology of Buddhist Monasteries in South Asia. The idea for the conference is the birth child of our Executive Director, Dr. Vijay Kumar Chaudhary, who has schematically designed each and every segment of the academic sessions. We hope all our participants, both online and who all are present here, benefit immensely from the deliberations that will take place spanning 2 days. Let's begin the conference by lighting the lamp. Light denotes knowledge. Passing from dark to light opens up our brain to accept new ideas. I invite Dr. Vijay Kumar Chaudhary and our esteemed speakers and ma'am to please light the lamp and start the process of gaining knowledge. All speakers, please come in the center. Ma'am, you're on, sir.
Can you repeat it, that chant?
Yes, sir.
It's okay. This is the sorter room. Yes.
I request Dr. Vijay Kumar Chaudhary, Professor Anura Manatunga, and Professor Max Dick to please occupy the chairs on the dais.
So should we already be prepared for the presentation, right? Oh, okay, so I still have to.
Please join me in welcoming Professor Max Dick from Cardiff University. I request Dr. Chaudhary to please present him with a bouquet and a memento. I'm pleased to welcome Professor Anura Manatunga from Kerala University, Sri Lanka. Welcome, sir. Sir, please present him with the bouquet and a memento. We at VHDS are lucky to find a leader in Dr. Vijay Kumar Chaudhary. I request Dr. Arun Kumar to please present a bouquet to sir from our behalf.
Oh, no. I don't need, I'm the host. No.
I request Dr. Vijay Kumar Chaudhary to please deliver the welcome address.
Is it possible to kind
So my dear friends, there's so much of technology these days in these presentations. So there are certain hiccups also. But it really gives me immense pleasure to be standing here for the welcome address on this very important occasion. Then for the next 2 days, we are deliberating on the history and archaeology of Buddhist monasteries in South Asia. In fact, the occasion to organize this seminar is very significant for us because our organization has been excavating a very important Buddhist monastery site called Telhara in the district of Nalanda. And as you go into Buddhism, you realize that you cannot understand anything related to Buddhism in isolation. Because all of you are aware that how fast Buddhism is spread all over the South Asia, East Asia and Far Eastern Asia. And it was such a closely knit circuit that if you have to understand even a unit of that Buddhist world, you have to understand it in totality. So it is a great opportunity for us here that we have an assemblage of very distinguished scholars among us. And I think I should start with Professor Max D, who is a professor of religious studies in Cardiff University, and Professor Anura Atunga, who was Director General of Government of Sri Lanka, and now he is a professor in university there, very distinguished professor. We have Dr. Ajat Sanyal from Calcutta University. We have Dr. Colin from Pondicherry, from Paris. We have Dr. Srikant from Deccan College, Pune. Dr. Patnaik, a very distinguished scholar from Orissa, who has done lots of excavations in Orissa and other parts of Deccan. So, and I'm very happy that in our midst we have very young scholars here, and I really urge you not to only carefully listen to what these speakers have to say, but also engage with them in their discussion. Your questions and your comments, I assure you, are as beneficial to you as for the speakers, because your questions and comments, you might think they are not very relevant, but they really set scholars think about their problems afresh. So I will really request you to go into that. So I really warmly welcome all of you today, and I think I will be failing in my duty if I don't remember my colleagues here, because they have been a part of the excavations, and without these young legs, I won't be able to do the excavations properly. And Dr. Arun, the coordinator of PhD's archaeological program, is there. Can you stand and so that we can clap for your contribution? And actually, he is now presently engaged in excavating a site called Bhadaria, which is in the district of Baka. So, good luck to you, Arun. You can sit down. And then Dr. Oisira, you have already seen her. Where is she? I think she. And Dr. Amit Ranjan, who is there. And he was my co-director of the excavation during the year 2021, isn't it? Yeah. So Dr. Amit Ranjan. And Sri Ajay Chakrawal, he is not a photographer, he is a very competent artist. And one young friend that is not here, but we cannot forget him. He's in Delhi now. He is Ravindra Joshi. He was the surveyor with us. So thanks to all. A very, very warm welcome to everybody. And here I will also welcome our friend Professor Sudhanshu Jha, who is heading the History Department of Central University. And indeed, I can't name all of you, but I'm very grateful for your presence and a warm welcome to each and every of you. Thank you. So now, without much ado, actually, these kind of events has lots of formalities, So our formality part is over. Don't forget, don't worry about that. No inauguration, nothing. So now let us go straight to the academic session. And may I request Professor Anura Atunga to please start the proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning to everybody. Thank you, Mr. Bijoy Chaudhary. And we have two lectures in the morning session. One is by Tax B, Cardiff University, and he's going to start his lecture now. It's on the Greeks and rules, Buddhist monasteries and monastic life in South Asia. The focus on Nalanda and Mandya. After his lecture, there is tea break, and thereafter you can listen to Bijoy Kumar Chaudhary. Now is the time.
But we have a discussion before the
Okay.
So, how long, Bijoy, do you want?
You can have 40 minutes.
How much do you require?
Well, I mean, you want to have half an hour or so, and then
Half an hour, 40 minutes.
It's 40 minutes according to the timetable.
yes, okay. So I try to leave enough space for discussion. If there is discussion, I think that. Everybody hears me clearly.
Yes.
Okay. Can I please have the PowerPoint?
Everybody please put your phones on silent mode.
Rishi, can I have the PowerPoint, please? Ah, yes, okay. How do I proceed?
I agree.
Is it working? Is this working?
Yes. I think so.
No, the pointer. Is this for scrolling?
No, it's you have to ask him to.
Ah, okay. Well, I hope I remember when you are supposed to scroll.
No, you can do that.
Really?
Oh, yes. Yes.
Oh. Oh, great. Thank you very much.
No, that's it. That's it. That's it. No, you know, that's it.
Okay, so this should actually. Yes, very good. Thank you. So, first of all, I would like to start with a thanks to my friend and colleague, Dr. Chaudhary, for not only inviting me to this conference, but also for the years of collaboration and support. I'm very grateful to be here, and I am at the pole position in a way. I think the reason for that is that I'm not an archaeologist. I'm a textualist, so I'm working with texts mostly, South Asian texts as well as East Asian texts, and the relevance for that we'll probably discover in a moment. So what I will be doing probably is maybe set the field in a slightly different way than probably an archaeologist or a material culture person would do. So I'm coming from a kind of textual perspective, and I'm looking at archaeology from that perspective. So let me start my presentation with a piece of anecdotal memory, so a biographical note if you like. After having finished my PhD, this is normally happening on rock concerts, so I'm hoping that this is not continuing. So after having finished my PhD in classical Indology, moving a little bit may help. Is it still clear?
Yes.
Okay. So after having finished my PhD in classical Indology on a Vedic topic, so I started India with studying the Veda, which is quite appropriate. It's the earliest period, obviously. I intended to redirect my focus on the study of ancient Indian Buddhism. Particularly Buddhist monasticism, so Buddhist monasteries, that is the way monks and nuns, of course, lived in communities in monastic institutions, monasteries as we call them. Having studied Pali and Pali texts, Theravada canon, in the hope of getting closer to the historical reality of Buddhism in South Asia, following the overcome assumption that these texts, the Pali texts, were the oldest textual material from which we study ancient Buddhism in India. I was still missing the information about monastic life in early South Asia, and thought to have found a remedy for this lack of information from Indic sources in form of Chinese Buddhist travelogues. Yeah, come on. It's not reacting. Anyway, can you scroll one down? Next slide. It worked. Oh, this is working.
The problem is with this one, not that.
Ah, okay. Can you? Yeah. Okay. Fine. No, it's working. No, he did it manually. Okay. So I refer when I'm pronouncing the names. I'm referring to the slide here. So I thought I could correct actually this missing pieces of information by actually looking at the so-called Chinese pilgrim records, I would prefer to call them travelogues, by people like Fa Xian in the beginning of the 5th century, Xuanzang, the famous one in the 7th century, and his follower, and this is the person I will be referring to in this presentation most, Yi Jing at the end of the 7th century into the 8th century. But even these sources did not yield much data about the daily life of monks I was interested in. It was only when I had the travelogues, so these texts actually of these Chinese guys, communicate with normative sources from the monastic codes, the so-called Vinayas, and attempted to contextualize archaeological data, that I started going back to more basic questions as how all the different strands of data in my work or maybe worked together. So all these three parts, the Vinaya, the travelogues, and the archaeology. In a recently published paper, I call these strands the triangle of data and tried to have them communicate with each other. In the same article, I also pointed out the flatness of archaeological monastic sites in northeast India, which makes it difficult to imagine how everyday life was in a big monastery like, let's say, Mahavihara, Nalanda. In a seminal article originally published in the year 1991, the well-known American Buddhologist Gregory Chopin pointed out that Buddhist monasticism in ancient India has been studied with what he calls a Protestant bias, a predilection of mostly normative texts, Vinaya texts, with a neglect of archaeological sources. So not even a triangle, this was only bouncing back between two sources. Chopin is certainly right with his claim, but one can and should turn around the table and point out that archaeologists dealing with Indian Buddhist monasteries have either the tendency to neglect or ignore textual sources, or are using them, or rather an unfortunate selection of the sources available, in a naive and badly understood way. I'm certain my colleagues here in this room will not do this, but I just want to point it out. In the end, I would claim there is no other way to get as close as possible to Buddhist monastic life, so kind of populate the sites, if you like, by bringing together as much evidence from the different strands of sources and contextualize them with the necessary hermeneutical caution developed in and required by the academic disciplines working on and with them. So from archaeology, from textual studies, and of course then, well, for both strands of textual studies. So I start with my first buzzword in the title, bricks. The nature of the archaeological evidence for a lay person like me. Now, a medievalist working with texts and interested in monastic culture in the European Middle Ages can undertake a very enlightening tour through the whole of Europe and visit many well-preserved monastic sites, Christian sites of course, which illustrate what he or she knows from the written sources. For a non-archaeologist textual Buddhist scholar like me, visits to the Buddhist monastic sites in the Gangetic Plain, so around here in Magadha, are often disappointing, particularly in the light of the expectations after having studied Buddhist monastic textual sources and the notoriously quoted Buddhist monks at monasteries in India by Sukumar Datta. The South Asian sites are either heavily reconstructed or in a state that makes it next to impossible for a layperson to recognize anything of what they would expect from textual sources containing sometimes quite vivid descriptions of monastic life. So for instance, if you go to the Mahasangika Bhikshuni Vinaya, so the Vinaya of nuns, there are quite a lot of stories in that Vinaya that gives you a very lively descriptions how nuns lived together, for instance, in cities, and that probably would have been in a Magadha context Pataliputra. Quite more often than not, linking the features of a monastic archaeological site with the information available in textual sources is next to impossible and rather leads to guesswork about certain features retrieved from the ground than to evidence-based insight. One problem here is the already mentioned flatness of the archaeological situation. Another crux is that a lot of material evidence which would help to explain a structural remain on a monastic site has irretrievably disappeared due to the impermanent nature of the objects made of wood, other botanic material, food, textiles, leather, palm leaves, etc. And unfortunately, these are exactly the types of material culture that the Vinayas refer to in most infinite details. So about monastic administration, monastic robes, about beds, about bedding and cushions, food, medicine, robes, posts for buildings, etc., etc. These have disappeared. But even integral architectural structures of a full-fledged monastic site, of a full-fledged monastery referred to in the Vinayas and other texts such as kitchens, refectories, toilets, bathing houses, altars, elevated seats for eminent monks for meetings and preaching, all these kind of structures are notoriously difficult to identify on the ground. Hopefully my archaeologist friends will confirm. A good example is, for instance, the hunt in inverted commas, for a library at Nalanda. Since the Tibetan monk scholar Taranatha, that is the 7th century AD, that's very important from which time the source comes from, who also states, by the way, that Nalanda was founded by Ashoka, question mark, that he reports a huge library facility. People do not give up trying to find the respective remains of such a library in the extant ruins of Nalanda. I would say, of course, without success. I think, and know from my experience, that only intensive and close collaboration between archaeologists and textualists will be able to bridge, in some cases at least, the gap between the different types of sources, my triangle as it were, and will enable us to correct the conclusions drawn from a one-sided view, from one specific viewpoint, the speculative interpretation of some archaeological evidence on the one hand, and the over-confidential reliance on normative or narrative textual sources on the other. I therefore will attempt to demonstrate the possibilities and necessities, but also the restrictions arising from such a combination of the two disciplines in the case of Nalanda Mahavihara. So first about the textual sources. So these are mainly those that are here on the slide. So my basic assumption for this paper is that at least between the 7th and 9th centuries, the majority of the community in the monastery of Nalanda, of the Mahavihara, and probably also in other monasteries like Telhara in the southern Bihar region, or ancient Magadha, connected with Magadha, followed the tradition of the Mula Sarvastivadin Vinaya. So one specific branch of Buddhist monastic code. Although there is no direct material evidence for that in form of archaeological data, unfortunately, or texts or inscriptions from the site, as far as I know, the fact that it was at Nalanda where the Chinese traveler and translator Yi Jing, that is number 3 here on the list, that Yi Jing actually studied exactly this Vinaya, may be taken as a strong enough evidence for this. Yi Jing himself, who translated the whole Mula of the majority of the Mula Sarvastivadin Vinaya, which is a huge text, into Chinese after coming back to China. Yi Jing himself seems to indicate this, that the Mula Sarvastivadin Vinaya was relevant in, at Nalanda in the introduction of his record, and the record is actually the text, the second one from the bottom, with a long Chinese title, Nanhai Jigu Nefa Zhuan, the record of the inner Dharma sent back from the Southern Sea. We'll talk about that a bit later. So he says in that text, in the introduction, generally, all that is discussed here in this record refers to the Mula Sarvastivadin Nikaya, and this should not be mixed up with the matters explained in the other Nikayas. So, Theravada, Staviravada, Mahishasaka, Mahasangika, etc., etc. It's only about the Mula Sarvastivadin Vinaya. Subsequently, I will discuss a selected example from a text written by I Ching, which is regularly taken and quoted as an eyewitness description of monastic life in India in the second half of the 7th century. This source is the just mentioned Nanhai Ji Nefa Chuan, subsequently called Record because it's short. It's in 4 fascicles, 4 chapters, and was allegedly written by I Ching and sent back to China when he stayed in Southeast Asia in the kingdom of Sri Vijaya on his way back to his home country, China. The text is often taken as a documentation of monastic life in India towards the end of the 7th century, but I suggest that a careful study and comparison with the Chinese translations of the part of the Mula Sarvastivadi Vinaya, which I Ching translated, will bring to light more parallels with the monastic code than the few studies that exist have shown so far. The conclusion from this observation is that the descriptive or documentary value of the record is smaller than often assumed. So it's not an eyewitness, it's rather kind of a projection from the Vinaya into another text. This does, of course, not mean that monks did not do things as described both in the Vinaya and in the record, but one has to look at case by case. Looking at them from a historical perspective, the cases where the record differs from the Vinaya certainly are clearer examples of actual monastic practice than the other examples. Already a superficial glimpse on I Ching's record shows that thematically he is following closely the topics of the Vinaya. He is also confirming with the Vinaya in what he leaves out in the discussion of monastic life. For instance, a description of where all these regulated procedures and daily acts of monks that we find in the Vinaya were situated, namely exactly in the monastery. He talks about what is done, but he does not talk about where it is done. Although the record is more about the correct behavior and customs of monks, it also gives at times some insight in the concrete living environment of these monks. But there you have to look. It's not evident. You have to really go into the text and look for it. This information then, so my hypothetical viewpoint, can be counter-checked against the archaeological findings at monastic sites. While the record is, as already emphasized, more or less following the regulations of the Mula Sarvastivada Vinaya, there is another Mula Sarvasti Vinaya text, because it's not only the Vinaya, it's also kind of ancillary text that exists, which contains commentarial notes by I Ching, which were probably based on his own experience and observations in Indian monasteries, particularly in Nalanda Mahavihara. One of these texts is the second one, the last one here, which is even longer as the previous one, but not as long as the Sanskrit names normally. Right? So that is the Genwen Shuo Yijie You Bai Jie Mo. So Sanskrit reconstructed, this would probably be something like Mula Sarvasti Vada Ekashata Karma. So it's about the karma procedures in a monastery. This is neither extant, by the way, in Sanskrit nor in Chinese. So the only or Sanskrit or in Tibetan. So this is only in the Chinese version. A text which has the advantage to sometimes also include notes or explanations by I Ching, so kind of interlinear glosses where he says, and this means the following. Yeah. These notes are interesting insofar as they seem to express again I Ching's own experience and observations during his stay at Nalanda Mahavihara. Now, one of these notes actually refers to a monastic structure which clearly existed, but, as far as I know, has not yet been identified at any of the monastic sites in South Asia. Namely, and can you go to the next slide, please? Yeah, this one. Namely, the so-called ordination platform, where not only ordinations were performed, but also, for instance, public lectures for the monks by the master actually were given. They would be called in Chinese Jietan, ordination platform. The Sanskrit reconstructed term probably would be something like Shila Mandala. This becomes extremely important in East Asian Buddhism, and it's probably an extension of what I Ching here describes. It's already relevant earlier, but it's, one can observe that beginning with the 7th century, the ordination platforms become increasingly important in the Chinese monastic context. It seems to be something that came from India originally. So this is the text from I Ching's Ekashata Kakaman, or the translation, and this is his note. So he's describing one of these ordination platforms in quite some details. You could even reconstruct it by using this text. I'm not going to read it out because it's too long, I will lose time, but you see that numbers are given, that sizes, measures are given, that shapes are given, so you can actually more or less reconstruct how such a platform at Nalanda, Mahavihara, or in, generally speaking, in Indian monasteries at that time, 7th century, actually were looking like. Can you give me the next slide, please? So this is a picture from Japan, from one of the oldest surviving monasteries in Japan, which is very close to the period of I Ching. It's in Nara, the old capital of Japan. And it shows the platform of a Chinese Vinaya master who went to Japan and kind of introduced stricter Vinaya regulations in Japan for the monastics at the time, Genjin or Ganjin in Japanese. And it shows something like the one described in I Ching's text. So it's a platform, as you see, there's a little chaitya on top of it. So it's following exactly what actually I Ching describes, minus the kind of superstructure. So if you read, well, can't read it because it's gone, but I Ching describes a kind of superstructure on top of the platform. So something like a chamber or something like that, a room, which probably may have been made of wood, so it's not there anymore, you wouldn't expect remains. And the Chinese and the Japanese obviously kind of discarded this kind of thing. There are, however, if you go to the next slide, please. Next. This is a relatively recent example from the 18th century from China, an ordination platform in a monastery in Jiangsu, the Longchangsi, where you have the platform, but you also have the superstructure. Yeah, so there seems to be some kind of reminiscence to that kind of old. And next slide, please. So here you have a wood block ring from the 18th century showing the same thing. And you can clearly see there is something on top of it. Yeah? So we may assume something similar was there in the Indian context. So the Chinese term I Ching uses here is not ordination platform, interestingly, but he says Tanchang in Chinese, which probably, well, which is explained in contemporary dictionaries in Chinese as mandala. So that shows you that the function was not reduced to just ordination, as in the Chinese case. It was a kind of multi-purpose thing. There were ordinations going on. We know that from other texts, from Buddha Samastibhati translation texts. But obviously, it was also a place where the abbot or the great master would be sitting and delivering sermons, doing Dhamma Bana talk. So, as I said, according to I Ching's note, the Indian Tanchang was a room-like structure with a door, so it could be closed. And I assume that probably the superstructure was wood. At least as far as I know, no such mandala structure has been identified by archaeologists at any of the South Asian monastic sites. I know that at Nalanda sometimes people explain in one of the southern courtyards a kind of platform-like structure as such a thing. But of course this has to be looked at more closely. So I would actually like to ask my archaeologist colleagues to keep an open eye for such structures. And there are more of these structures which actually you probably could only make sense of when you're looking at the Chinese notes that I Ching has produced on these structures. We'll come to another example in a moment. Now, reconstructing the Mahavihara. That means Nalanda. Yeah. While it may be difficult to connect textual information with archaeological data from monastic sites, in a lot of cases, we still can and should try to assess the validity of the textual sources, as I tried with this one example before, by individual sets of information, which assumedly are confirmed by the archaeological situation, and thereby identifying the function of certain material cultural findings on a monastic site in a more precise way, not just guesswork, saying, oh, this probably is but really saying, oh, it looks as if this is what is, for instance, described in the Chinese text. One of the best known examples is, of course, Nalanda, of a monastery, discovered, excavated, and raided, I would say, in the 19th century. The monastery, as far as it is excavated and reconstructed, reflects a quite complex structure of remains, as you all know, which are, despite the certainty with which these are sold in situ, so when you go and look at the explanations, everything's clear, but everything is not so clear, I would say. The uncertainty already starts with a question, and this is my focus now, on the historical extension of the monastery, of the monastic complex. It is clear and mostly accepted now by scholars that the excavated site, at the same site the ASI protected and UNESCO World Heritage Site, is only a portion of what was a much larger monastic center called, therefore, Mahavihara, the great monastery, Daci in Chinese. I Ching even gives the title in full transliteration, so we get a confirmation about the late 7th century through I Ching, through the Chinese guy, that this was called Mahavihara, Nalanda Mahavihara. Actually, it even says Shri Nalanda Mahavihara. So I think my time is actually coming very quickly to the close. If you go through the next slide, please. I will skip these text examples and go to the slide when, yeah, please stop here. So my point is that, and I will kind of paraphrase this now a little bit shorter, that I Ching in his record gives a description of the bathing customs in Buddhist monasteries. So that's a general description what happens not only probably in monasteries but generally in India at that time. And he talks about bathing ponds, about tanks, where people quite naturally would then take a bath. And he says that around Nalanda Mahavihara there are about 10 big tanks, ponds, in which the monks actually, on the sound of the Gandhi, so when the bell is actually rang, go out, come out of the monastery and take a bath. So these are the most important elements in the original text, which I've translated in the full-fledged paper. Now, if you look at a map of Nalanda, and this is an archaeological satellite photo, which was given to me by, gratefully by my friend and colleague Andy Rajani, you can clearly see marked by her the water bodies around it. Yeah? If you count them, well, it's not exactly 10, but of course we have to be very careful, because water bodies, of course, can change shape. Can change number by being divided into more and things like that. This is something probably geoarchaeology has to decide in a closer look. So you can clearly see the water bodies around it. This seems to confirm what I Ching says. It says that there are ponds around it, and the ponds are really around a much bigger area than the ASI protected site. Right? So the extension that I Ching describes, saying, well, they go out of the monastery and then they take a bath, kind of gives you an idea how big the monastic site really was. And it probably also gives you kind of an idea where the surrounding wall of the whole complex actually has been. Probably closer to the ponds than to the ASI site. Yeah? So I'm not sure, but maybe archaeologists going outside of that protected site may still be able to discover something. Right? Then also with the ponds, I would make a request to the archaeologists to go and look at the ponds in a little bit more detail and see if there are remains of bricks, if there is anything. There must have been guards, because at some point in the Vinaya it's clearly said if you come out of a bathing pond, of a tank, you have to be very careful not to kill insects and living beings. And then it tells you how actually you should come out. And that certainly was not a natural tank. There was embankment, there was something. Yeah? So with a monastery like Nalanda, you would expect something like that. Would be my suggestion. Now that these tanks actually were actually kind of related to the monastery in the way I suggest and I Ching describes is clear. Can you go to the next slide, please? Yeah, we have to go into We have to go into presentation mode, otherwise. Yeah, here you see it again. Here, this is important now. Andy Rajani has suggested that not only Nalanda but other sites in Bihar and other places, for instance Somapura and other monastic sites, have an interesting feature by being not exactly in a south-north orientation. So they have a slight tilt to the east, as you can see here, right? So it's quite clear that the direction is like this. Yeah? I'm not going to detail why that is. If you are interested in why that may be, you have to read Rajani's article. He says something about constellation and so on and so forth. But for me, the important point was, next slide please. Is this the one? Yes. So this is black lines, which I try to draw, for instance, at the site of the Nalanda, the pointer. Does this work? Ah, yeah, okay. No, okay. Okay, thank you. So, you see the black line that I drew here? There are some other black lines, very small, unfortunately, because it's so small. And I try to identify where the sides of the ponds actually are lining up with the orientation, with the direction of the monastery. Some of them may still kind of reflect the original position. So the ponds actually would then have been constructed in a way that were following exactly the monastic layout. Yeah? This, of course, is important. Why is it important? Because it shows that they were not deliberately natural water bodies that were maybe extended, but they were actually really grouped around the monastery in a very planned way. And that would again confirm then that we should be looking for the kind of borders of the monastery rather in this area. I don't know how far it goes up. It could go up pretty much to the north, and there are actually remains that have not been excavated properly. So my point, of course, then being, and here I will close, that taking the text, what I had in Beijing, 10 ponds around, which were used as bathing ponds, and using the situation as far as we know it, and bring them in communication, actually will open up new insights. And obviously also some new tasks for the archaeologists, because I, as a textualist, would say, you have to go and you have to do something, because so far, this hasn't been done. So I hope I have demonstrated, at least in the case of 2 examples, how a fruitful, not fully successful, but a possible fruitful communication between text and archaeology actually could work. Thank you very much.
We are in time. Actually, we finished it in time. And now we have 15 minutes for discussion. And the floor is for you. You can ask questions from him and you can give your comments or something you wish. Yes, please.
Is there a possibility to give a microphone to the...
First of all, thank you, Professor Max, to a wonderful session. So my question is, how you see the core concept of Buddhism, which avoids the materialistic life? And you were talking about the material culture and materialistic life in monasteries. So do you think that there is contradiction in the basic principle of Buddhism and behavior of monastic life?
In what sense? I didn't get the first part of the question. What is the contradiction you are suggesting?
Between the description in the text and the proper material evidence that you can get in the archaeology.
No, actually the question,
I think that was not the question.
Aims at whatever you are showing the material life, The Buddhism is known for the spiritualism. So the contradiction between spiritual dimension of
I think that's not so much a problem of real historical Buddhism. It's probably rather a problem of our presumptions how Buddhism ideally should be or should work. So the idea that, for instance, that a Buddhist monk in a monastery shouldn't be in a Buddhist monastery at all, because that's already some kind of material something. You should be, as the old texts say, in the wood underneath a tree. But of course they settled in some way. So the monastery already is a kind of contradiction to that idealized picture of Buddhism, and it probably never was like that. I mean, these people were still living human beings. They had to eat, they had to sleep, they had to obviously take a bath, because otherwise they would stink and they would probably never get any food from the donors. So there are some kind of, pretty basic life preconditions which force the Buddhist monks, and the Madhyama path, of course, the middle path, the Buddha actually prescribed is actually exactly about that. Don't do it like the giants, do it in a different way. So you have, of course, this ideal projection of a Buddhist monk's or nun's life in the text, in the Vinaya text, for instance, where everything is regulated. Why does it have to be regulated? Because, of course, they're human beings. They're constantly kind of transgressing the rules. Therefore, you have the rules. So it's a very kind of human approach to things that you have already in the earliest text. And my claim would be that it is the hyper-idealized way some people are looking at Buddhism. Oh, they're spiritual and they kind of where we have a problem. I don't have a problem with it, because I'm treating historical Buddhist monks as human beings. They have to do all these things other people are doing as well. And they're trying to kind of keep that discipline and kind of reduce, but it still happens. Therefore, they need toilets in the monasteries, they need bathrooms. They even had saunas. I didn't go into that, because that was one other text passage where a bathing house, a steam house in a way, is described in each text. So you would, if you could find it, you would find a steaming house in the monastery, because they had that. Why do you need a steaming house? That is, I mean, if you go to a sauna nowadays, you have to pay quite a lot of money to get into a sauna, because it's, of course, it's expensive to build, it's expensive to maintain, it's expensive to produce the steam. They still had it. And there are other things where actually we constantly see that there is, even in the historical situation of Buddhism, a constant kind of confrontation between ideal and reality, where they constantly kind of adjust things, say, okay, this has gone too far, so you can't do this. And you can't accept the money just like that, because in the Vinaya it said you should not, as a monk, accept the money. Yeah? While in China, for instance, it was quite normal that they took the money, no problem. So in different cultural settings, things were acceptable, in others they were not. I don't know if I've answered your question to some extent, but...
So, thank you so much.
I have a comment. Can everybody hear me? I will not be confused by that technology again. So I have a comment, and I will go query also. First of all, of course, congratulations to you for really bringing your points very, articulately. My comment is that you are talking about the tanks that M.B. Rajni has brought through the satellite imagery. I had the chance to look at these tanks, because my wife, Dr. Poonam, is sitting there. She has documented the natural heritage of Nalanda district for intact. She has produced a very detailed report of that. And in that process, when I went to the surroundings of Nalanda, which I had explored because of my archaeological visit here to the project, then I could see that there are large tanks, large tanks. The tanks, in fact, extending up to 100 acres, 200 acres of land, And there are specific names to those tanks. For example, one huge tank just in front of where now Nalanda Mahabihar is situated is called Indra Sarovar. Another is a huge tank which is named after lotus. I'm forgetting the exact.
Yeah.
Digi
and Pushkarini. Yeah.
Digi Pushkarini.
I think the Pushkarini is the one down there, and the Digi is the one up top in the north. That's the Digi.
I also thought that Nalanda Mahabihar, with huge structures, really required lots of brick making activities, and where the bricks would come, digging into the land and really creating lots of and then these will develop into tanks naturally. You cannot build such huge structures without really changing the landscape for tanks. That is one comment. Another is the old problem, and I want to have your take on that, between the hierarchy between Bihar and Mahabihar. Now Nalanda is called Mahabihar, so is Telhara. Pratham Shivpur Maha is also a Mahabihar. So any inkling, though it's a ticklish question even for the text, I know that, but I really want to have your take how the text differentiates between, say, Bihar and Mahabihar.
Okay, so to the first comment that you made, I think these two possibilities, and of course that's taking the bricks from what is now the tanks, is not is an idea that has been kind of ventilated earlier already at some point, and I think it's absolutely plausible, but it of course does not exclude the kind of purposeful layouting of the tanks. You can take bricks somehow from the ground, but you can also say, wait a minute, we need the bricks, so at the same time we need the tanks. So let's actually kind of align. We know how the monastery should look like, how it should be layouted. So let's actually take from there in a way that then kind of creates the water infrastructure around the monastery. So it does. I would say both things don't exclude each other. So the second point with the Mahavihara. So again, now unfortunately, of course, Indian texts don't tell you anything about that. I Ching does. So I Ching, the Chinese guy, he pretty much talks about everything. He's a very kind of talkative person like me. So he in the record, I think it's in the record, he gives a definition of what a Mahavihara is, and I think the first one is Mahavihara is called Mahavihara because it's big. Well, that's probably science. But there's another explanation, and you're probably aiming at Telhara, which is not as big as Nalanda Mahavihara. It still is a Mahavihara. The second definition he gives is it's also called Mahavihara if they have a lot of donors. So that could fit actually the Telhara situation. Donors, so patrons giving money. So if you use the second definition, you have a smaller monastery like Telhara, which is still called a Mahavihara. You still can make a point, and clearly there is support. I mean, if you in a short period create a monastery like Telhara, as we know by now, still quite big, not as big as Nalanda, but big, then that comes from donations. So it's the second one which then may give you. He gives two definitions. I have to look into the text again. It's actually you can find that in in Anjana Sharman's book on heritage and things, where I have an article on the Chinese reports on Nalanda. Everything's translated there. I can give you that. Yeah. So the definitions are there. Of course, it's difficult to say, is this really reflecting how the Indians thought about it? But I think it makes sense in a way to explain at least the discrepancy between the size of a monastic site and the title Maha. So Telhara would be a good test case.
If you allow me to take cue from Chaudhary's comment, yes, Mahabharata is mentioned in I Ching's text, and he's talking about two definitions. But if we look at the epigraphic sources coming from the sites, from the contexts, we have specific reference to Mahaviharas, Viharas, and Viharikas. So, in an apparent hierarchy, Mahavihara, Vihara, Viharika. Then we have Mahaviharas, which are, as you have already discussed, of the size of Nalanda, and then of the smaller size of Telhara, and we have some other sites in eastern India having such Mahaviharas of smaller size, not as big spatially as that of Nalanda. We also have materials from sites showing Vihara inscriptions. What I found, it's a very preliminary observation that what we see archaeologically in the Mahavihara sites, we have the organic plan of the monastery not connected with the shrine which is located at the center in each of the cases. But when you are looking at a vihara which is almost invariably supported by bastions on four corners. Now, so far we have two examples. One is the Nanda Devi Vihara from, that's again is named with Dihi. Nanda Devi Vihara is the name of the monastery, where you have the shrine, the central shrine, connected with the organic plan of the monastery itself. The same is the case with another monastery, but I won't spell it out because the name has not yet been published. It's the same case of Vihara, and the sanctum is located at one corner, connected organically with the body of the king.
As Telhara in the description of Xuanzang, right? The shrine is not in the center, it's actually...
That's why my question is, if it is so, then the sanctum is connected organically with the body of the monastery, then it shouldn't have been a Mahavihara. And as I say, as we were discussing in the morning, in the later inscription from Telhara, I'm sure he will show that inscription. It's called a Vihara. So there are evidence of transformation within even one side.
Yes, so this is a very good example of what I'm after, communication between disciplines, because we had this conversation in the morning over coffee, no, not coffee, over tea. You told me that
if you allow me to interrupt, the last thing is Viharika. We have references to Viharika in inscriptions from Bengal and from Eastern India. Oh, am I not louder enough? We have inscriptions from Eastern India talking about Viharikas. We have so far no excavated site which yielded evidence of a Viharika. Recently, we have found one example from site recording the name of a Viharika, but unfortunately that site is not yet properly, that the Viharika part, I'll be talking about that, the Viharika part has not been possibly excavated. So we are not keeping aside the question of organizational issues. If you look at the physicality of the structure, even in that, on that score, the identity of Viharika is not yet known. My question would be, do we have these in texts? The hierarchy of the Mahavihara.
You have Viharika in the text, for example. Vihara and Mahavihara.
No, I mean, so far.
Only Mahavihara is the thing that is mentioned.
Yeah, Mahavihara versus...
No, Vihara is not also in the text.
Don't have Vihara.
Well, Vihara is there all the time because, of course, I mean, if you look at...
But in the general sense of a monastery, but
yes.
not in the sense of Vihara as something inferior to
Mahavihara. But now, this is a conversation which is going now on the ground, so it's a good example how, for instance, this communication could work. From the Chinese context, we're talking about the 7th century, right? When the Chinese Yijing and Xuanzang are actually in India, they are bringing information back. And of course, that has a huge impact on the Chinese thinking about monasteries. And exactly at that time, you have the establishment of what would be in Chinese a Mahavihara. So they establish 大寺, great monasteries, in all the main provinces. So it is linked to the administration of the Chinese Empire. And of course the question then is there an Indian influence coming through these pilgrims? Is again the Chinese situation reflecting at some, like with a platform, with the ordination platform, is the Chinese innovational kind of structure in monasteries reflecting something that came from India? And I would say in this case there is a very good case for it, because what you just described, that the shrine actually is kind of moved to the periphery, not to the periphery, but to the encompassing structure. This is exactly the layout that you have in Chinese monasteries, and it starts obviously in the Tang period, exactly in that period. So that you have a kind of the shrine is always, you come into a monastery from the south, you go through a gate, which south orientation, of course, is not something you would find in India, but anyway, that's an old Chinese kind of thing. Then you move towards the north through a couple of halls, and the main shrine, normally the so-called Shaka, Japanese Shaka then, the Shakya shrine, where the statue of Shakyamuni is sitting, is actually at the north, close to the northern wall. So that's pretty much exactly the same layout. So, you see...
May I bring a very interesting point here, talking about Bihar and Mahabihar. Actually, in the inscriptional evidence, as you perfectly well know, that there is a reference to Bihar being attached to Nalanda. If I am not wrong, it is Angrami Bihar, which is Pratibadha Nalanda Mahabihar. So that is also a dimension that Biharas are some institutions which are attached to the mosque.
Affiliated to the But it's
I think you are correct. In Sri Lankan condition, we have Mahavihar. The Mahavihar is the principal vihar. It has some branches outside, right? But it is not the biggest vihar. The big viharas are Abhayagiriya and Jetavana are bigger than Mahavihar. But we call it a Mahavihar because that's the principal one, central one.
Central one.
Yes, and then there are some branches.
Affiliated.
So that's good point.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there we are entering very problematic territory, because, how to say, there are no Indian texts who are streaming everything from kind of randomly preserved inscriptions. They may give you a bigger picture, but of course it's very hard to actually...
Yeah.
And from my Chinese side, very often the voices don't speak. I mean, they have a certain interest, and that's what they express in the text. If we are lucky, we can actually, as I tried to show, we can combine that information with something that comes from either textual, epigraphical side from the Indian side, or archaeology. And that's, I think, the only thing we can do. So that communication is essential, because as we've shown it on stage, that this actually can lead to a fruitful discussion and maybe a result.
Are there any more questions or comments? There's your time now, 11:50.
Time for tea break and then...
Yes, it's the
There's a tea break. Oh, that's nice.
Then we'll go for tea break.
Yes,
Then 15 minutes for
yes,
this.
go on. Oh, yeah, okay. Tea there, right at the corner.
Tea at the corner?
Okay then.
Thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
Thank you for the advice. Usually, we have a lot of flowers. Me? Flowers. Later. Okay. Don't sit on it. That's nice, this one. Thank you very much. Another piece in the collection. We have one shelf at home where we put everything, including Divas Ganesh. Yeah, it's nice. I hope this was It's not really something that has been done since several fields. So if you don't go into, let's say, the real text that I Ching translated, you're looking for notes, as I did, where does it say something about the altar or this and that, how the structures are doing. That was never translated. If you're not the text person, you don't have access. You need to be made aware first of all, and then you have to deliver the information in a respective way. And as far as I see, I'm working on it and doing it. Yeah. But even with teaching, you have to be very careful, as I hopefully demonstrated, because it's not necessarily an eyewitness description. It is, it's very normative. It's partly, people have now started now professor, associate professor, Tsinghua in Beijing. She has actually started comparing bits and pieces from the Mullah Sabastan Vinaya with the record, teachings record. In two cases, and has actually shown how, which I already knew, she has done meticulous work. And sold as kind of, this is what they do. And she's in the footnote in my paper. I know she's Chinese, but in order to training knowledge is very she's a little digest. It's like a tank. You can't stop her. I remember when she was there, we had conversations that I said something. She was completely ignoring what I was saying. She just had her mind on something. She said, wait. I think we should continue. Oh, by the way, the microphone, you are the next one.
आवाज आता है आपका स्पीकर का और पार्टी का सेक्शन में ना उसमें क्या होगा जैसे बोल रहे थे एक आदमी को वो मैं जा रहा हूँ एक मिनट बाद मैं जा रहा हूँ सबका सेंटेंस होगा तो वो आ जाएगा क्योंकि अभी हम वो नहीं सुन रहे ना ऑडियंस का तो बाहर जाकर वेस्ट हो गया
said. And it's then enriched by the narrative. So you get this I'm not teaching service actually provided because if you, for instance, teaching is very static. That's why it's travel around. There's not there are so many ones they study Masanka, whatever, and that's pretty much what it is. So easy. If you are after the next evaluation, what I said to my talk, not really. Because his mind was on that. We have to translate that. So what I but if I'm not really thinking at all, I will not even get the question. I know. Okay. Yes, see, that was my question. How do I clear your head? Now I'm clearing your head. You mean that I physically answer not type? I can speak. Again, I mean, well, thank you. I don't have it, I'm sorry, but I got you also. Yes, but we don't have to do it. Noises.
Yeah, no, right, actually, everything first.
I'm trying to find a balance between where everything already properly deal with these questions. So no questions in case I know that you gave you're right. You need someone to check text. You can't rely on necessarily the organization. You have to ask very specific questions. What exactly does the text say? Here, exactly. Gentlemen, here. And you have to articulate your questions. I'm interested in the following technical aspect of the text. Can you give me information? That's the way to do it. Otherwise, probably would be this collaborative form.
Questions such as would be looked for.
For instance, what and how do you prevent essentially when how do they translate the grammatical way? Just for instance, Nala in Tibetan text is never called Nala, it's called Nala. Why is it? It's nothing to do with Nala.
That's just a way of translating. The range then becomes Nalanda does have
I don't think so. I think there was something else behind it. Well, Susan explains, says in these techniques, what I call something like what's that place name that existed much before and then it made up so that's exactly what it is. That point, whether you use text yeah, but so and then how does it who explains the Naga? Who does that? Yeah, that works in Sri Lanka, but it doesn't necessarily work in India. My question is actually kind of the question is, does this reflect what actually E.G. for Atomic explains? And somebody read it and said, so then this is a populist. It's a populist. Yeah, that makes it kind it seems to me that it's relatively
We have to wait for somebody you know that how she it's not, we don't pay but we need to pay right presentation. We need to do so it's not easy to identify those. Can you pick up from the top surface? Maybe the